There is a particular kind of distance that almost nobody talks about, because almost nobody can describe it without sounding paranoid. It does not begin with betrayal. It does not begin with an argument. It does not even begin with a visible act of rejection. It begins with a feeling so subtle that most people dismiss it before they ever examine it. You walk into a room filled with people you have known for years, and something in the atmosphere has changed. Nobody says anything cruel. Nobody openly challenges you. Nobody turns their back. But the warmth that used to exist now feels thinner than it once did. Smiles seem slightly delayed. Laughter feels forced. Someone who once leaned toward you now leans away without realizing it. And somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary conversation, you can feel that your presence is being received differently than it was before. Most people experience this and immediately blame themselves. They replay every recent interaction. They wonder whether they said too much, whether they became too distant, whether they unknowingly offended someone. The mind searches for a clear event because human beings prefer a painful explanation over a mysterious one. It feels easier to believe you made a mistake than to sit with the unsettling possibility that something deeper is happening around you. Because if there is no obvious cause, then the discomfort feels impossible to control. And what people fear more than rejection is often confusion. Carl Jung understood something that many people spend their entire lives missing. He understood that not all hostility begins with conflict. Some of it begins with exposure. Some of it begins when one person's presence quietly touches something another person has spent years trying not to feel. Jung believed that every human being develops two identities. The first is the one the world sees. This is the social self, the acceptable self, the self carefully shaped to fit expectations, avoid judgment, and maintain belonging. Jung called this the persona. It is the version of ourselves that knows how to smile when we feel anger, how to appear confident when we feel fear, how to appear generous while secretly needing approval. The persona is not always fake. Sometimes it is necessary. It helps us function. It helps us survive. But it is still a mask. Beneath that mask lives something else. Beneath the polished version of the self lives everything a person has pushed away in order to become acceptable. The jealousy they denied, the fear they buried, the weakness they could not admit, the ambition they were taught to feel ashamed of, the rage they learned to hide, the grief they never processed. Jung called this the shadow. And the shadow does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It waits. It remains alive in silence, influencing behavior from places most people never consciously examine. This is where resentment becomes more complicated than people want it to be. Because people do not always resent you for what you have done to them. Sometimes they resent you because your existence unsettles the fragile story they tell themselves about who they are. A person can spend years constructing an identity that feels stable, respectable, and morally safe. Then they encounter someone whose presence quietly reveals the cracks in that identity. Not through accusation, not through confrontation, but simply by existing in a way that reflects what the other person has abandoned inside themselves. That is what makes this form of resentment so difficult to recognize. It rarely announces itself honestly. People almost never say, "Your life makes me uncomfortable because it reminds me of my own compromises." They do not say, "Your honesty forces me to confront how often I perform." They do not say, "Your boundaries make me realize how much I relied on your lack of them." The human ego is far too protective for that kind of directness. Instead, resentment disguises itself. It appears as criticism. It appears as coldness. It appears as subtle dismissal. It appears as distance that seems to come from nowhere. Someone who once celebrated your progress suddenly calls you different. Someone who once admired your discipline suddenly calls you obsessive. Someone who once depended on your availability suddenly says you have changed. And because the language sounds ordinary, most people never realize what they are actually witnessing. They assume the problem is interpersonal, when the problem is often psychological. The painful part is that the more self-aware you become, the easier it is to sense this shift before anyone admits it. You notice the energy in a room before you notice the words. You hear what is absent in a conversation as much as what is spoken. You feel when affection has become obligation. And because nothing appears dramatic on the surface, you can begin doubting your own perception. That is often the cruelest part of hidden resentment. It does not just create distance. It creates self-doubt. Jung believed that what remains unconscious controls us in ways we rarely understand, and nowhere is that more visible than in relationships. People often believe they are responding to who you are, when in reality, they are responding to what your presence activates inside them. The version of you they react to may have less to do with your actual character than with the internal conflict they have never resolved. They may not be seeing you clearly at all. They may be seeing their own shadow reflected back through you. Once you understand that, something begins to change. Not immediately, not comfortably, but the confusion starts to lose its power. Because there is a difference between being disliked for what you did and being resented for what you represent. One asks for accountability, the other asks for awareness. And many people spend years apologizing for wounds they never created, simply because nobody taught them the difference. The deeper truth is unsettling. Some people do not secretly resent you because you harmed them. Some people secretly resent you because your presence reminds them of the person they could have become if they had been willing to face themselves. And once you begin to see that, you cannot unsee it. One of the most uncomfortable realities about human relationships is that growth does not always attract admiration. Sometimes it attracts resistance. Most people are taught to believe that becoming healthier, wiser, calmer, or more authentic will naturally improve the way others respond to them. It sounds reasonable. It sounds fair. It sounds like the kind of moral logic people want the world to follow. Become better, and your relationships should become better with you. But life rarely moves according to comforting ideas. Sometimes, the more you evolve, the more tension you create in people who are comfortable with the older version of you. Jung understood that transformation changes social dynamics long before it changes circumstances. The moment a person begins becoming more conscious, they stop participating in certain unconscious patterns. They stop apologizing for boundaries. They stop seeking approval in places where approval was once necessary. They stop shrinking to preserve someone else's comfort. And while this can feel liberating internally, it can feel threatening externally, because every relationship forms around a certain emotional structure. People learn who you are to them. They learn how you respond. They learn what role you unconsciously play in their life. And when that role changes, even quietly, some people experience that change as loss. Imagine someone who has always known you as the person who says yes, the person who listens endlessly, the person who smooths over tension, the person who makes everyone else comfortable, even when you are uncomfortable. Over time, that dynamic can begin to feel natural to both people. Neither person may consciously question it. It simply becomes the shape of the relationship. Then, one day, something shifts. You begin respecting your own limits. You begin speaking more honestly. You begin refusing what drains you. From your perspective, this feels like healing. From their perspective, it can feel like betrayal. Not because they consciously want to control you, Often it is more subtle than that. They simply became attached to the version of you that made their own life easier. And when that version disappears, they feel something they may not know how to name. That feeling often becomes resentment. This is one of the hidden sources of social tension. People often say they want the people around them to grow, but what they usually mean is that they want people to grow in ways that do not disrupt existing emotional arrangements. They welcome your growth as long as it remains convenient. They celebrate your healing until it changes how accessible you are. They support your confidence until it stops making you easy to influence. They admire your self-respect until it forces them to confront how little they have developed their own. That is where resentment often begins. Not in your success itself, but in what your success silently reveals. Your discipline can expose someone else's excuses. Your peace can expose someone else's chaos. Your honesty can expose someone else's performance. Your courage can expose someone else's avoidance. And because these realizations are painful, many people unconsciously choose the easier path. Instead of examining themselves, they reinterpret you. They make your growth the problem. Suddenly you are arrogant, distant, cold, self-righteous, difficult. These labels can sound believable because they are often wrapped in ordinary language. But beneath them is frequently the same unconscious mechanism. It is easier to resent your transformation than to question their own resistance. Jung described projection as the process by which people disown parts of themselves and then encounter those disowned parts in others. The mind protects itself by externalizing what feels unbearable internally. This means that what people criticize in you is sometimes the very thing they cannot tolerate in themselves. The person who accuses you of being selfish may be confronting their own suppressed selfishness. The person who calls you emotionally detached may be facing their own inability to be vulnerable. The person who says you think you are better than everyone may be confronting the insecurity they have spent years hiding. None of this means every criticism is projection. Sometimes feedback is real. Sometimes people do see something in us that needs attention. Jung never suggested becoming arrogant enough to dismiss every difficult interaction as someone else's shadow. That would simply become another form of unconsciousness. The deeper challenge is discernment. Learning the difference between genuine accountability and projected discomfort. Learning when to reflect and when to stop carrying emotions that were never yours to begin with. That distinction matters because many people internalize resentment that was never truly about them. They spend years softening themselves to keep peace. They become smaller to appear safer. They abandon parts of themselves just to preserve relationships that were only stable when they were less whole. And over time, that creates another kind of suffering. The pain of losing yourself in order to remain acceptable. What makes this especially tragic is that some people will never consciously understand why they resent you. They may genuinely believe their discomfort is about your personality. They may believe they are responding to your behavior. They may never realize that what disturbed them was the way your presence interrupted the image they needed to maintain of themselves. The resentment feels real to them because the emotion is real. Only the source remains hidden. And that is why hidden resentment can feel so disorienting, because you can sense the emotional truth of what is happening, even when nobody around you can explain it honestly. You feel the distance before the story forms. You feel the shift before the words appear. And sometimes your nervous system understands what your conscious mind is still trying to deny. The difficult lesson is that becoming more yourself does not always make life more comfortable. Sometimes it simply makes invisible dynamics impossible to ignore. There are few things more unsettling than realizing that your calm can disturb someone more than your anger ever did. Most people assume conflict creates discomfort because conflict is visible. Raised voices are easy to identify. Harsh words are easy to remember. Direct hostility at least gives the mind something concrete to understand. But some of the deepest discomfort in human relationships appears in silence. It appears when you stop reacting the way people expect. It appears when your inner stability quietly interrupts the emotional patterns other people unconsciously rely on. Many relationships are built on predictability. Not always manipulation in the dramatic sense, but emotional predictability. People learn how to move around each other. They learn what produces reassurance, what produces guilt, what produces compliance. Without ever speaking about it, every relationship develops a rhythm. One person withdraws, the other chases. One criticizes, the other explains. One becomes upset, the other rushes to repair. Over time, these patterns become so normal that neither person questions them. They simply become part of the structure of the bond. Then one person changes. Maybe you stop defending yourself every time someone misunderstands you. Maybe you stop over-explaining. Maybe you stop reacting emotionally to provocations that once controlled you. Maybe you begin listening without rushing to rescue everyone else's discomfort. To you, this can feel like maturity. It can feel like emotional regulation. It can feel like peace. But to someone who has always relied on your predictable responses, that same peace can feel deeply unsettling. Because when your reactions change, the old emotional script stops working. A person who once knew how to influence your mood may suddenly feel powerless around you. A person who once relied on guilt to maintain closeness may feel strangely disconnected when guilt no longer works. A person who once felt secure because they could read you easily may become anxious when you become less emotionally available to unconscious patterns. And because most people do not think in these terms, they often translate that discomfort into judgment. They say you have changed. They say you have become cold. They say you are harder to talk to. They say you are not the same anymore. Sometimes these statements contain a grain of truth. You are not the same. That is often the point. But what many people mean is not simply that you changed. What they mean is that the version of you they understood no longer exists in the same way. And what they feel is not always sadness. Sometimes it is resentment. Jung believed that consciousness changes relationships because consciousness exposes unconscious contracts. Many people are not only attached to who they think you are, they are attached to how your identity supports their identity. The friend who always felt wise around your insecurity may feel threatened by your confidence. The partner who felt needed around your instability may feel displaced by your independence. The family member who relied on your silence may feel challenged by your honesty. Your growth can quietly rearrange the emotional hierarchy people never admitted existed. This is why self-development can sometimes feel lonelier than people expect. The external world does not always reward internal change immediately. Sometimes your healing first reveals which relationships were built around your wounds. Sometimes your clarity reveals who was only comfortable with your confusion. Sometimes your peace reveals who unconsciously needed your chaos, and none of that requires anyone to be evil. That is important to understand. Hidden resentment does not always come from malicious people. Sometimes it comes from wounded people. Sometimes it comes from people who care about you, but have not yet learned how to relate to the version of you that no longer suffers in familiar ways. Sometimes people grieve the old version of you because the old version fit into their life more easily. Sometimes they resent the new version because the new version forces change they never asked for. That is what makes this dynamic emotionally complex. It is rarely as simple as villain and victim. Often it is two nervous systems reacting to change in different ways. One person is trying to become more conscious. The other is trying to preserve psychological stability. And when those two needs collide, resentment can emerge even where love once existed. Jung warned that people often fear in others what they have not integrated in themselves. A person who has not made peace with their own power can feel threatened by yours. A person who has not faced their own truth can feel destabilized by your honesty. A person who has not accepted their own shadow can feel uneasy around anyone who no longer hides theirs completely. This does not mean you are responsible for everyone else's discomfort. It means awareness changes what you can see. Once you understand that some people respond not only to who you are, but to what your presence activates, many experiences begin to make more sense. The strange distance, the subtle criticism, the sudden coolness after your growth, the tension with no visible cause. The more painful realization is that some people preferred the version of you that was easier to manage, not because they consciously wanted to hurt you, but because unconscious relationships often feel safest when nothing evolves. And when you stop being who someone unconsciously needed you to be, their discomfort can quietly become resentment before either of you fully understands why. One of the hardest truths to accept is that resentment often hides behind ordinary language. People rarely reveal it in a way that makes recognition easy. If someone openly said, "Your life forces me to confront my own choices," you would understand immediately. If someone admitted, "Your boundaries make me realize how often I ignored my own," the dynamic would become visible. But hidden resentment almost never speaks honestly. It speaks through smaller things. It disguises itself as concern, humor, distance, or subtle correction. And because the delivery feels socially acceptable, many people miss what is happening for years. Someone says, "You seem different lately." On the surface, that sounds harmless. Sometimes it even sounds caring. But context matters. Sometimes different means healthier in ways that no longer serve their expectations. Sometimes different means less willing to tolerate behavior you once ignored. Sometimes different means you no longer make yourself available on demand. The words appear neutral, but the emotional tone underneath them can reveal something else. What sounds like observation can quietly be disappointment that your growth has changed the relationship. Another common form of hidden resentment appears through minimization. You share something meaningful in your life, and instead of genuine acknowledgement, the response feels strangely small. Your progress is luck. Your discipline is obsession. Your confidence is ego. Your peace is detachment. The external response may sound casual, but psychologically it serves an important function. If your growth can be reduced, it does not need to be confronted. If your transformation can be dismissed, then the mirror you create becomes easier to avoid. Jung understood that the ego protects itself in subtle ways. Most people cannot tolerate prolonged internal contradiction. If your presence activates unresolved pain, the mind quickly searches for relief. Sometimes that relief comes through distortion. Instead of asking, "Why does this person unsettle me?" the mind asks, "What is wrong with this person?" That shift protects identity. It allows someone to preserve their self-image without facing the deeper source of discomfort. This is why resentment often intensifies when you become more authentic. Authenticity sounds universally admirable in theory, but in practice, it can be disruptive. A person living behind a carefully maintained persona can feel deeply uncomfortable around someone who no longer performs in the same way. Your honesty can expose their performance without you saying a single word. Your refusal to participate in social theater can make them aware of how much of their life is still built around it. And awareness can feel threatening, not physical threat, not obvious threat, existential threat. Because when another person embodies a truth we avoid, they can unintentionally challenge the foundation of who we believe ourselves to be. That challenge can create admiration in some people, But in others, it creates resistance. And when resistance remains unconscious, it often becomes resentment. This is why some of the strongest resentment comes from people who once felt closest to you. Strangers can judge you, but proximity creates comparison. The people who know your history know who you used to be. They remember the version of you that was easier to understand. When your identity shifts, they cannot simply observe your change. They feel it in relation to themselves. Your growth can force them to measure their own life against changes they may not feel ready to make. That can create a painful internal question. Why are you changing while I remain the same? Many people never ask that question consciously. They only feel the discomfort of it. And because unexamined discomfort seeks an external target, the emotional pressure often moves outward. It becomes criticism, withdrawal, passive hostility, emotional distance that appears unprovoked. The tragedy is that people on the receiving end often respond by shrinking. They become quieter, softer, more careful. They begin abandoning parts of themselves to reduce tension in others. They interpret hidden resentment as evidence that they should become less visible, less honest, less themselves. Over time, this can become a pattern of self-betrayal disguised as harmony. Jung would have recognized that as dangerous, because repeatedly sacrificing authenticity for acceptance creates an inner fracture. The outer self remains socially acceptable, while the inner self becomes increasingly abandoned. And the more disconnected a person becomes from themselves, the easier it becomes to live according to other people's unresolved fears. The deeper challenge is not becoming defensive. It is becoming discerning. Not every uncomfortable response means someone secretly resents you. Sometimes people are simply adjusting to change. Sometimes concern is genuine. Sometimes conflict is necessary. But hidden resentment leaves a particular emotional signature. It feels less like direct honesty and more like subtle punishment. Less like truth and more like withdrawal. Less like communication and more like a quiet attempt to make you feel wrong for becoming who you are. That is why awareness matters. Because once you can recognize the difference between accountability and projection, between concern and control, between discomfort and resentment, you stop interpreting every cold reaction as proof that something is wrong with you. Sometimes what changed was not your worth. Sometimes what changed was what your presence began to reveal. Perhaps the most difficult part of all of this is accepting that not everyone can walk beside the person you are becoming. People like to believe that relationships survive because history matters. Shared memories matter. Loyalty matters. Love matters. And sometimes they do. But history alone cannot protect a relationship from psychological truth, because relationships do not only survive on affection, they survive on whether both people can tolerate who the other person becomes. Jung believed that the goal of psychological life was not perfection, but individuation. Individuation meant becoming whole. It meant integrating the parts of yourself that had been split apart by fear, shame, and social conditioning. It meant becoming less fragmented, less performative, less dependent on external approval. But individuation changes more than the self. It changes the entire emotional field around you, because the more real you become, the harder it becomes for false dynamics to remain comfortable. Some people will move closer when that happens. Those people recognize something in your honesty that calls to their own. They may not always understand you, but they feel relief around your authenticity because it gives them permission to become more honest too. But other people will move away, not always dramatically, not always consciously. Sometimes they simply become colder. Sometimes they stop reaching out. Sometimes conversations become thinner. Sometimes they begin treating you as if your growth itself is an accusation. And in many cases, they may not even know why. That is the part many people struggle to accept. Hidden resentment is often unconscious, even in the person who feels it. They may sincerely believe you changed in a negative way. They may genuinely think you became difficult. They may never realize that what became difficult was not your personality, but their relationship to your transformation. Because your presence now asks a question they do not want to answer. What have I avoided in myself? What have I tolerated for too long? What have I become comfortable pretending not to see? And for many people, those questions feel heavier than distance. So they choose distance. That does not always make them bad people. Sometimes it simply makes them unready. Unready to face themselves. Unready to face change. Unready to remain close to anything that threatens the identity they still need. That is why one of the most mature things a person can learn is this. Not every withdrawal is a reflection of your failure. Some withdrawals are a reflection of another person's limits. Some people can only love the version of you that does not challenge their inner world. Some people can only stay close while your growth remains theoretical. Some people can only support your healing until it changes how they feel around themselves. And if you do not understand that, you can spend years trying to repair relationships that were never damaged by your cruelty. They were strained by your clarity. That does not mean becoming arrogant. It does not mean assuming every difficult person is jealous. It does not mean turning your pain into superiority. Jung would have warned against that too, because the shadow can hide inside spiritual pride just as easily as insecurity. The point is not to believe you are above anyone. The point is to understand that hidden resentment often reveals more about internal conflict than surface behavior. And once you understand that, you stop asking a destructive question. Why does everyone change when I become more myself? You begin asking a better one. Who can actually remain close to the truth of who I am? That question changes everything, because it shifts your attention away from managing perception and toward recognizing alignment. It teaches you that some people are not leaving because you became harder to love. Some are leaving because the version of you they loved depended on your self-abandonment. And once self-abandonment ends, certain connections cannot survive in the same form. That realization can feel painful, sometimes deeply painful, because even understanding a pattern does not make loss painless, but it can make loss meaningful. And meaning changes suffering. It allows you to stop shrinking every time someone becomes uncomfortable. It allows you to stop treating hidden resentment as evidence that you should return to an older version of yourself. It allows you to see that becoming more conscious will not always make you more accepted, but it can make you more real. And in the long run, reality creates a different kind of peace. Because eventually, you understand something many people never do. Some people do not secretly resent you because you hurt them. They secretly resent you because your life reminds them of the parts of themselves they can no longer ignore. And once you understand that, you stop apologizing for becoming who you were meant to be.